Somewhere in the hills of Clarendon, underneath cane fields and goat pastures and roads that haven't been repaved in 20 years, there is a number that 3 of the biggest mining companies on Earth have spent the past 2 years trying to confirm. It is not a small number. It is the kind of number that, if it holds up, changes what Jamaica is to the rest of the world, not a tourist destination with a debt problem, but a country sitting on one of the richest undiscovered gold and copper systems in the Caribbean basin. Barrick Gold, the second largest gold producer on the planet, has already staked a claim to 4,000 square kilometers of Jamaican land, roughly 1/3 of the entire island, betting the rock beneath it behaves the same way the rock behaves at a mine in the Dominican Republic that generates more money in 3 months than most Caribbean nations collect in tourism revenue. In a year, a New York-listed copper giant has committed up to $75 million to a single property 2 hours from Kingston. And in a community that has already lived through one gold promise that collapsed and left families without running water, drill bits have hit gold again, less than 2 kilometers from the ruins of the old mine. The question this story is built around is not whether there is gold in Jamaica. There is. The question is who ends up holding it when the drilling stops, and whether the parishes sitting on top of it will look anything like the wealth being pulled out from underneath them, or whether Jamaica is about to relive, at a much larger scale, a version of the same story it already knows too well. Before we go further, if you're new here, this channel exists to track exactly this kind of story. The ones that don't make it into a 5-minute headline, but that will shape property values, employment and government revenue for Jamaica, Guyana, and the wider Caribbean for the next 20 years. We're building this channel toward 20,000 subscribers, and every one of you watching this, especially those of you who've been with us since the early days on Guyana's oil boom, is what gets us there. If a story like this deserves your attention for the next 45 minutes, it deserves a subscription too. It's free, it takes 4 seconds, and it means you don't miss the next chapter of a story that is still being written in real time, right now in 2026. To understand why 3 multinational mining companies are moving with this kind of urgency, and why Jamaican families in London, Toronto, and New York should be paying closer attention than a passing headline usually earns, we have to start with the one time Jamaica actually tried this before, and what it left behind. In May of 2001, in a small community called Pennants in the parish of Clarendon, an Australian company named AusJam opened Jamaica's first documented gold mine. It arrived the way these things usually arrive, with promises attached to it. The company projected 35,000 ounces of gold coming out of the ground over the life of the operation. For a community that had spent generations farming marginal land with no major industry nearby, that number meant something concrete. It meant jobs. It meant residents believed the kind of infrastructure investment that follows industrial activity almost everywhere else in the world: paved roads, reliable electricity, and above all, piped water in a part of the island where water access had always been unreliable. For a short window, some of that hope was justified. Real jobs did go to Pennants residents. People who had never worked for a wage before were suddenly employed by a foreign mining company extracting a metal that trades in dollars on markets thousands of miles away. It didn't last. By December of 2002, a year and a half after the mine opened, AusJam had pulled somewhere between 12 and 16,000 ounces of gold out of the ground, less than half of what the company had projected when it arrived. Geologists working the site at the time estimated perhaps another 3,000 to 4,000 ounces remained accessible. The ore simply wasn't there in the concentration AusJam needed to keep the operation financially viable. By 2003 and into 2004, the company was citing financial losses and preparing to shut the mine down entirely. In 2011, Jamaica's National Environment and Planning Agency made it official, formally declaring the Pennant site a restricted area. The gates closed. The equipment left. What stayed behind is the part of this story that mining press releases never mention. And it's the part that matters most, if you're trying to understand why the current gold rush is being watched so carefully by people who actually live on top of it. Residents who had been counting on that mine for steady income were, according to local reporting gathered in the years after the closure, still owed final pay that never arrived. One farmer who lived near the site later told a reporter that he had expected the mine's arrival to bring paved roads and dependable water access to the entire surrounding area. Instead, when AusJam shut its doors and left, the piped water system the company had been supplying to the community was disconnected on its way out. Families who had briefly had running water for the first time in their lives went back to depending on rainfall or paying out of pocket for water trucked in from elsewhere. That is not ancient history. That is a community still living in Clarendon today that watched a foreign mining company make a specific promise, fail to deliver on it, and leave the place worse off on its way out the door than the company found it on its way in. That memory is the invisible weight sitting underneath everything happening in Jamaican gold mining right now. Every company operating in the region today knows that history, whether they say so publicly or not. And every resident living near the new exploration zones knows it too, because in a small community, that kind of memory doesn't fade in 20 years. It gets passed down at kitchen tables. So when Barrick Gold, when Freeport McMoRan, when a junior explorer called C3 Metals all started showing up in the same stretch of Jamaican countryside within 18 months of each other, the first question anyone with that history in their bones is entitled to ask is simple. Is this different, or is this the same story with better funding behind it? The honest answer, based on the scale, the data, and the companies involved, is that this time is meaningfully different in one specific respect. What's different is not intention. Companies rarely announce bad intentions in advance. What's different is the depth and independence of the data underneath the current activity and the size of the balance sheets now attached to it. The engine behind almost everything happening in Jamaican gold and copper exploration right now is a private company called Geofix Jamaica, founded by a man named Robert Stewart, known throughout the industry simply as Bobby Stewart. Stewart's background is not what you'd expect from someone who ends up controlling the most valuable geological dataset in Caribbean mining history. He spent close to 30 years working in technology and hospitality, industries with almost nothing in common with drilling programs and geochemical assays. Roughly 6 years ago, he started Geofix on a premise that sounds obvious once you hear it, but that nobody else had acted on at this scale. Jamaica, despite more than a century of bauxite mining and decades of speculation about other minerals, had never actually been properly surveyed using modern exploration technology. Stewart's bet was that whoever built the most complete geological map of the island first wouldn't just find gold. They'd control the single most valuable asset in the entire sector, which isn't gold sitting in the ground. It's the knowledge of precisely where to look for it and where not to waste money looking. Speaking at a mining conference in Toronto earlier this year, Stewart confirmed that his team has now sampled essentially the entire island of Jamaica outside of officially protected land. 45,000 separate geochemical assays covering rock, stream sediment, and soil samples, layered on top of airborne geophysical surveys flown over huge stretches of Jamaican terrain that had never been mapped this precisely before. Geofix doesn't primarily operate as a mining company. It operates as a mapping company, and once a company has mapped an entire country that nobody else had bothered to map properly, the largest mining companies in the world tend to come looking for that company, rather than the other way around. What Stewart's team built is closer to a full subsurface scan of Jamaica than a handful of marked locations on a map. Any company with enough money can charter a helicopter, strap a magnetometer to it, and fly over one hillside looking for anomalies. That's how exploration usually starts, small, localized, opportunistic. Geofix instead spent 6 years and, by Stewart's own account, tens of millions of dollars of the company's own money building a layered dataset across nearly every accessible square kilometer of the country, combining geochemistry, airborne geophysics, and structural geological mapping into one unified picture. That kind of dataset does not get built cheaply, and it does not get built by accident. Stewart has stated publicly that the company spent close to $1 billion Jamaican dollars in a single 12-month stretch, collecting roughly 40,000 of those geological samples, a spending pace he has openly described as unsustainable for a private company to carry indefinitely on its own. Bringing in partners with the balance sheets of Barrick and Freeport McMoRan wasn't simply an appealing opportunity for Geofix. By Stewart's own account, it was close to a financial necessity. In May of 2024, that necessity turned into one of the largest exploration agreements Jamaica has ever seen. Barrick Gold, the world's second-largest gold producer, signed what the industry calls an earn-in agreement with Geofix. If you've never encountered that term before, think of it as a structured rental-to-own arrangement for mineral rights. Barrick doesn't simply buy Jamaican land outright and take full ownership on day one. Instead, it gains access to Geofix's territory, in this case roughly 4,000 square kilometers, and it earns increasing ownership stakes over time by spending money on exploration and hitting specific technical milestones along the way, with the potential to reach up to an 80% joint venture interest if it keeps meeting those targets. Barrick isn't guessing blindly here. The company's own comparison point for what it hopes to find in Jamaica is a mine it already operates in the Dominican Republic called Pueblo Viejo. That mine alone produces more than 800,000 ounces of gold every single year, and it generated $81 million in operating profit in just 3 months of production, based on figures reported in 2024. Barrick's own geologists have concluded that Jamaica's underlying rock formations are geologically similar enough to what sits beneath the Dominican Republic to justify placing this bet. By last August, Barrick was publicly targeting drill-ready sites in central Jamaica by the end of 2025, with a second target zone, known among geologists as the Paleocene Belt, expected to reach drill-ready status in the first half of this year. Gold was trading around $3,300 an ounce around the time of that announcement, close to record highs. Exactly the kind of price environment that makes a company the size of Barrick willing to take a serious financial swing on an island most of the mining world had written off decades ago. Barrick is not the only major name attached to this story, and this is where the picture gets even more significant. In February of last year, Freeport McMoRan, a New York Stock Exchange-listed copper giant, signed its own earn-in agreement, this time with a smaller, publicly traded exploration company called C3 Metals, covering a property known as the Bellas Gate Project. The structure mirrors Barrick's arrangement, and the numbers behind it are specific and public. In the first stage, Freeport commits $25 million to exploration spending over 5 years to earn a 51% interest in the property, with C3 Metals remaining as the operator on the ground throughout that period. If Freeport chooses to exercise a second stage, an additional $50 million committed over 4 more years would bring the company's total possible stake to 75%, along with the right to take over as operator entirely. Added together, that's up to $75 million of Freeport's own money committed to a single Jamaican mineral property across roughly a decade. That is not the behavior of a company hedging a speculative bet. That is a company willing to put real sustained capital behind a real sustained timeline. And unlike the Barrick side of this story, which is still working toward drill-ready targets, C3 Metals has already drilled and it has already returned laboratory-confirmed results. In May of 2024, at Bellas Gate, the company reported a drill intersection of 294 meters averaging 0.30% copper and 0.13 grams per ton gold, starting essentially from the surface. That is not a projection based on modeling. That is a confirmed laboratory result. In September of that same year, at a separate joint venture with Geofix called the Superblock Project, located less than 2 kilometers from the old failed Pennants mine, C3 Metals announced it had intersected gold mineralization in the first 4 scout holes it drilled. Sit with that for a moment. 2 kilometers from a mine that broke a community's trust 20 years ago, the same rock system, chased by a different company with better funding and better data, has come back positive. It isn't folklore this time. It's an assay report signed off in a laboratory. Now to what's happening as of this year, because this story has moved significantly even since those initial results came in. C3 Metals has spent much of 2026 expanding what it knows beneath Bellas Gate at a scale that goes well beyond where the company started. The company completed a large-scale 3-dimensional electrical geophysical survey, known in the industry as a 3DIP survey, covering more than 80 square kilometers across 2 major porphyry trends running through the property, named the Provost, Connors, and Camel Hill systems. Unlike earlier surveys at the site, which could only reliably read the geology down to around 300 meters, this new survey was designed to see reliably beyond 700 meters underground, and in places potentially to a full kilometer of depth. What it found were multiple strong, deep-seated chargeability anomalies, the kind of underground electrical signature that experienced geologists associate with concentrated mineral deposits, aligning precisely with the Connors and Camel Hill trends the company had already identified at the surface. The historical drill results underneath those targets are worth hearing in full, because they explain exactly why C3 Metals is willing to spend more money going deeper. At the Provost prospect, previous drilling returned 285.9 meters grading 0.37% copper and 0.21 grams per ton gold. At the Connors prospect, previous drilling returned an even more striking number, 309 meters grading 0.44% copper and 0.33 grams per ton gold, including a higher grade zone within that interval, running 79 meters at 0.71% copper and 0.49 grams per ton gold. Based on that data, C3 Metals has now designed an 11-hole diamond drilling program totaling roughly 10,800 meters, specifically built to test what sits beneath those anomalies at depth. That program is scheduled to begin in October of this year and run through April of next year, which means that as you're watching this, the drill rigs chasing the answer to this story are either already turning or weeks away from it. There's one more thread to this that most coverage of Jamaican gold hasn't caught up to yet. In a recent interview, Bobby Stewart confirmed that Geofix's relationship with Freeport McMoRan isn't limited to the Bellas Gate property already publicly reported. Geophysics is now working with Freeport in a second, separate area of Jamaica, the details of which have not yet been made fully public. Stewart also confirmed something that widens this story well beyond gold and copper. Geofix has identified two separate sources of rare earth elements within Jamaica, the category of minerals critical to everything from electric vehicle batteries to defense technology, and currently dominated almost entirely by Chinese supply chains. If that turns out to be commercially significant, Jamaica's relevance to this story stops being a regional mining footnote and starts becoming a small piece of a much larger global conversation about who controls the minerals modern economies actually run on. Context matters here because rare earth elements aren't traded the way gold is. Roughly 70% of global rare earth mining and an even larger share of the processing that turns raw ore into usable material currently runs through China, a concentration that has become a genuine strategic concern for the United States, the European Union, and Japan over the past several years as electric vehicles, wind turbines, and defense systems all depend on a small handful of these elements to function. Any credible alternative source, even a small one, tends to attract attention from governments and manufacturers far beyond what the raw dollar value of the deposit alone would suggest. If Geofix's two identified sources in Jamaica turn out to be commercially viable at any meaningful scale, Jamaica wouldn't just be adding a new export category. It would be positioning itself in a small but real way inside a supply chain conversation that touches Washington, Brussels, and Tokyo, not just Toronto and New York. That is a very different kind of leverage than gold or copper typically carries, and it's still too early to know whether Jamaica's rare earth sources are large enough to matter at that scale, but it's a thread worth watching alongside everything else happening underground right now. To understand what these companies are actually looking for underground, and why the language in their press releases keeps repeating two specific technical terms, it helps to understand the geology in plain terms, because it explains why this particular stretch of Jamaica has attracted this level of institutional attention rather than being written off as one more speculative mining story. The terms are porphyry and epithermal, and they describe two different ways gold and copper end up concentrated underground. A porphyry deposit forms when a large body of molten rock cools slowly deep underground over hundreds of thousands of years, allowing metals like copper and gold to spread out and concentrate across a broad, low-grade cloud of rock that can still add up to an enormous total volume across a deposit spanning several kilometers. An epithermal deposit forms differently much closer to the surface, when hot mineral-rich water moves through cracks and fractures in rock, often leaving behind narrower but significantly higher-grade veins. C3 Metals has now identified both types across its Jamaican properties, broad porphyry targets at Bellas Gate and higher-grade epithermal zones closer to the old Pennants trend at Superblock. That combination is not evidence of one isolated lucky pocket of gold. It's evidence of an entire mineral forming system that operated across a wide stretch of central and western Jamaica millions of years ago, the exact kind of geological setting that has produced some of the largest gold and copper districts on the planet elsewhere in the world. If this is the point in the story where you're starting to wonder how much of this is genuine geology, and how much is exactly the kind of hope that has burned Jamaican communities before, That instinct is worth sitting with because it happened again recently in a much smaller and far more human way. In January of 2023, in a community called Chester Castle, in the parish of Hanover, workers digging a routine pit for a house's sewage system hit unusual, shiny soil about 10 feet down. Within a single day, word had spread through the community and well beyond it. People began traveling in from Ocho Rios and other towns, arriving to dig with their bare hands, filling plastic cups with what they were convinced were gold nuggets. Videos of the digging circulated widely across Jamaican social media within hours. One resident told a reporter she had already sold 2 pieces of what she'd dug for 4,000 Jamaican dollars the day before, fully convinced she knew exactly what real gold looked like. Some residents described crying with relief on the spot, already mentally spending money they didn't yet have, already reworking plans for what that money could change in their lives. Jamaica's Mines and Geology Division sent a geological team to inspect the material almost immediately. Their determination, delivered through laboratory testing rather than guesswork, was pyrite, sometimes known as iron sulfide, a mineral that shares gold's color and metallic shine almost perfectly, but carries essentially none of its value. Some residents did not accept the government's test results even after they were delivered, still convinced that what they had dug up and sold was genuine gold. That episode illustrates, more clearly than any press release could, exactly how much hope a single word, gold, can generate in communities that have spent a long time waiting for something, anything, to change their circumstances, and exactly how quickly that hope can outrun the underlying facts on the ground. Here's why that distinction matters for understanding everything else in this story. What happened in Hanover was an uncontrolled, entirely informal dig, carried out by residents with no geological training whatsoever, evaluating material purely by eye and by hand. What is happening right now at Bellas Gate and Superblock is controlled diamond drilling, professional core logging, and independent laboratory assay work, carried out by licensed geologists working for companies that answer to shareholders and regulators in Toronto and New York. It would be a mistake to treat every gold story coming out of Jamaica as identical, because some of it genuinely is wishful thinking and some of it this time is backed by institutional capital and years of independently verified laboratory results. Both of those realities are true about Jamaica at exactly the same time right now, and that's worth stating plainly rather than smoothing over. 3 well-capitalized, independently governed mining companies are conducting methodical, multi-year exploration programs backed by tens of millions of dollars and independently verifiable assay results. At the same time, the country's most recent large-scale gold operation collapsed after overpromising and under-delivering. Its decades-long extractive history with bauxite has been mixed at best for the communities living directly on top of the resource, and 2 years ago, its own citizens spent days digging up worthless pyrite because a single word, spoken in the right place, was enough to pull people in from 3 towns over. The geology itself doesn't care which of those 2 narratives ends up shaping public perception. It's already sitting in the ground, waiting for someone with enough money, enough patience, and enough drilling equipment to establish exactly what it's actually worth. It's also worth understanding what stands between where these companies are today and an actual operating mine, because that process is one of the few genuine safeguards Jamaica has this time that it arguably didn't have during the AusJam era. Any project moving from exploration toward extraction has to pass through Jamaica's National Environment and Planning Agency, the same regulatory body that formally shut down the Pennants site in 2011. That process requires an environmental impact assessment, public consultation periods where affected communities are legally entitled to raise objections, and a mining lease negotiated separately through Jamaica's Mines and Geology Division, covering royalty rates, local employment commitments, and environmental bonding meant to fund site remediation if a company walks away the way AusJam did. None of that guarantees a better outcome. Regulatory processes can be under-resourced, and a government negotiating with a company the size of Barrick is negotiating from a position of real structural disadvantage, no matter how well-intentioned its officials are. But it does mean that this time, unlike 2001, there is at least a formal documented process standing between a promising drill result and a bulldozer showing up in someone's backyard, and it's a process residents in Clarendon and Hanover are entitled to participate in, not simply observe from the sidelines. There is an important caveat sitting underneath every number in this story so far. and it's one that responsible reporting on this topic can't skip past. Not one of these three projects, not Barrick's, not Freeport's, not C3 Metals, has yet produced an independently certified resource estimate. In the mining industry, that's the specific figure that establishes, with audited certainty, how many ounces are provably recoverable from the ground, verified to a standard called NI 43-101, the level of independent scrutiny typically required before serious institutional capital changes hands at scale. What exists right now across all three of these projects is target identification, extensive geochemical sampling, and early to scout stage drilling. That's encouraging. It's specific. It's backed by companies with the money and the technical staff to keep pushing forward. But it is still technically exploration, occupying roughly the same stage Jamaica's offshore oil story occupied before its own independent audit eventually came through. That gap between confirming gold is present and confirming exactly how much of it can be profitably extracted has a very real financial dimension, and it's clearest when you look at the smallest of the three companies involved. As of a company filing referenced in late 2023, C3 Metals Jamaican projects carried a total book value of roughly $15.1 million, up from about $10.5 million the year before, with $0 of booked revenue against that value. That's entirely normal for a junior exploration company ahead of a proven discovery, but it matters enormously for the government's side of the ledger, and by extension for what ordinary Jamaican families eventually see from any of this. Jamaica has been reported to stand to collect a royalty in the range of 5% from C3 Metals' eventual extractions, layered on top of standard corporate tax revenue. 5% of nothing is nothing. 5% of a mine operating anywhere near Pueblo Viejo scale is a materially different number entirely, one that could move real money through parish-level economies for a generation. Which outcome Jamaica ends up with depends entirely on whether these exploration programs graduate into an actual producing mine, and on precisely how the final royalty and tax terms get negotiated once a real independently audited resource estimate exists for anyone to negotiate over. If you're watching this in London, in Toronto, in New York, and wondering why this specific detail, a 5% royalty rate on a project that hasn't even confirmed its total resource yet, deserves your attention over dinner conversation with family back home, the honest answer traces directly back to bauxite. It's not a flattering comparison to make, but it's the accurate one. Jamaica has exported bauxite and alumina for more than 70 years. One of the country's oldest and largest industries by export volume. For the majority of those 70 years, the profits generated by that industry flowed disproportionately toward the foreign companies, doing the extracting, while Jamaican communities living directly on top of the bauxite deposits absorbed the environmental cost, red mud waste ponds, degraded farmland, restricted water access, without receiving a proportional share of the wealth being pulled out from beneath their own homes. This is not speculation or grievance dressed up as analysis. It's a well-documented pattern that shows up repeatedly in extractive industries where small, capital-poor countries negotiate over long time frames with capital-rich foreign partners who have far more experience structuring these deals than any single government negotiating team typically does. Gold and copper mining run on the exact same structural mechanics. A foreign company brings the money and the technology. A Jamaican company or government brings the land access and the local knowledge. The terms of who ends up with what percentage of the eventual profit get negotiated years before a single ounce of gold is ever sold to a refiner. For Jamaican families abroad weighing what any of this actually means for relatives back home, land values near these exploration zones, real employment prospects in the mining towns growing up around them, and the future value of property sitting on a newly interesting geological belt could all shift considerably, but only if the terms Jamaica negotiates this time genuinely differ from the terms that shaped 70 years of bauxite extraction, and only if the country's negotiators have learned something specific from that history, rather than repeating it with a different metal attached. It's worth being precise about the scale of what a discovery at Barrick's level could actually mean for the country, because the number is large enough that it changes the entire conversation. Barrick's own comparison point, the Pueblo Viejo mine in the Dominican Republic, produces more than 800,000 ounces of gold every single year. at a gold price near where it has traded through 2025 and into 2026. In the neighborhood of $3,000 an ounce, a mine producing even a modest fraction of that Dominican output would move hundreds of millions of dollars a year through the Jamaican economy across royalties, wages, local contracting, and tax revenue combined. That's not a marginal figure sitting quietly next to tourism revenue. That's the kind of number that shows up directly in a national budget, the kind that can fund infrastructure, healthcare, and education at a scale annual tourism receipts rarely achieve on their own. At the same time, and this is the part worth holding on to with equal weight, Jamaica's bauxite industry has generated billions of dollars in export revenue across 7 decades, and the parishes sitting on top of the largest bauxite deposits are not, on average, the wealthiest parts of the island today. Revenue generated at the national level and prosperity delivered at the community level are not automatically the same thing. Closing that specific gap is the task now facing Jamaican negotiators in real time as this moves from exploration into whatever comes next. It's worth pausing on what kind of employment actually shows up at each stage of a project like this, because the jobs available during exploration and the jobs available during production are not the same jobs, and conflating them is part of how expectations get set too high before a mine ever opens. Right now, at the exploration stage, the roles filling up around Bauxite and Superblock are drill crews, sample technicians, site security, local logistics support, and community liaison staff, real employment, but a relatively small headcount spread across a wide area, and heavily weighted toward contract and seasonal work tied to drilling campaigns rather than year-round positions. If any of these properties graduate into an actual producing mine, the employment picture changes substantially, potentially into the hundreds of direct jobs at a single site, plus a meaningfully larger multiplier through local contracting, transport, and supply. But that shift is years away at minimum, and it depends entirely on results that haven't been confirmed yet. The AusJam experience in Pennants is the clearest local example of why this distinction matters. Real jobs did appear when that mine opened. They also disappeared within roughly 18 months when the ore didn't hold up, leaving workers who had built their household budgets around that income with no notice and no severance most residents describe as adequate. Whatever comes out of Bauxite and Superblock, the diaspora families weighing this story against relatives back home are better served treating early exploration stage hiring as exactly what it is, useful but temporary, rather than mistaking it for the start of permanent, mine-scale employment that hasn't been earned by a confirmed resource yet. There's a useful comparison sitting right next door in the way Guyana has structured its own resource windfall, not because Guyana has gotten every part of its oil negotiation right, plenty of economists would argue it hasn't, but because the contrast illustrates how differently these negotiations can be structured depending on when a government asserts itself in the process. Guyana negotiated its production sharing terms with ExxonMobil before drilling confirmed the true scale of what sat offshore, terms many analysts have since argued left more value on the table than a government negotiating from a position of confirmed reserves would have secured. Jamaica, by contrast, still has the choice in front of it. None of these 3 Jamaican projects has an independently certified resource estimate yet, which means the country's negotiators are approaching royalty and tax terms, in theory, before the full scale of what's underground is locked in, the exact leverage point Guyana didn't fully have available to it. Whether Jamaica's negotiators use that timing advantage effectively, or whether the deals get finalized quietly once the geology is confirmed, and the leverage has already shifted toward the mining companies holding the data, is a detail worth watching as closely as any drill result coming out of Clarendon this October. I want to ask you something here because this is exactly the kind of question worth sitting with rather than scrolling past. If you had to bet right now on which outcome Jamaica gets from this gold story, the Pueblo Viejo outcome, where the wealth genuinely reaches ordinary families and rewrites parish-level economics for a generation, or the bauxite outcome, where the export numbers look impressive in a national report, while the communities sitting directly on top of the resource see comparatively little of it, which one would you put your money on, and why? Leave that answer in the comments because I read every single one of them, and on a story with this much uncertainty still ahead of it, your read on how this plays out is genuinely as valuable as mine. Let's put the full timeline of how quickly this modern exploration effort has actually moved, because the pace itself tells you something about how seriously the companies involved are treating Jamaica's geology. Around 2019, Geofix begins its intensive island-wide sampling campaign, while a smaller company called Karub Corp, later rebranded as C3 Metals, starts building its own position in the country. In March of 2024, C3 Metals and Geofix formally combine efforts on the Superblock joint venture, sitting directly adjacent to the old Pennants mine. In May of 2024, Barrick signs its 4,000 square kilometer earn-in deal with Geofix, and within that same month, C3 Metals reports its 294-meter copper-gold drill intersection at Bellis Gate. In February of 2025, Freeport McMoRan commits up to $75 million to that same Bellis Gate property. By August of 2025, Barrick is publicly discussing drill-ready targets by year's end. In September of 2025, C3 Metals confirms gold mineralization in its first scout holes at Superblock, less than 2 kilometers from Pennants. By March of this year, Geofix confirms it has mapped essentially the entire island. And by August of this year, C3 Metals has completed an 82 square kilometer deep geophysical survey at Bellis Gate, and is preparing to drill nearly 11,000 meters starting this October, chasing targets buried up to a kilometer underground. 5 years, 3 multinational partnerships, and a complete geological picture of a country that spent most of the last century being told repeatedly that its mineral potential simply wasn't worth the investment. That pace stands in sharp contrast to how long it actually took Barrick to reach the same conclusion about the Dominican Republic, where Pueblo Viejo sat through decades of on and off exploration by multiple operators before eventually becoming one of the largest gold mines in the Americas. Jamaica has compressed a version of that same due diligence process into roughly 5 years, and the reason is not luck. It's that one private company spent 6 years and the better part of $1 billion Jamaican building the exact dataset that allowed 2 of the world's largest mining companies to skip nearly a decade of preliminary exploration that most frontier mining regions typically require before anyone with serious capital shows real interest. Before we get to where the story goes next, if you've made it this far, that tells me you're exactly the kind of viewer this channel is built for, someone who wants the full picture rather than a headline stripped of context. If that's you, take 4 seconds and hit subscribe, because we're tracking this exploration program alongside Jamaica's offshore oil story and Guyana's own resource boom, and there's a real chance you'll want to be here when the next drill results land, likely sometime after this October's program gets underway. What happens next in this story is no longer primarily a geology question. The rock has already told these companies enough to justify spending real money chasing it further. What happens next concerns what gets negotiated in boardrooms and government offices far from the drill sites themselves, how much of the eventual profit stays inside Jamaica rather than flowing out to shareholders in Toronto and New York, how much local employment actually materializes on the ground versus how much gets automated or filled by outside technical staff flown in for the specialized work, and whether the communities sitting directly on top of these deposits get treated as genuine partners in this, rather than the way Pennants was treated 2 decades ago. Bobby Stewart has said publicly that this represents an extraordinary opportunity for Jamaica to build an entirely new pillar of its economy. That opportunity is real, and the data behind it is far more rigorous than anything Jamaica had access to during the AusJam era. Whether that opportunity actually gets built in a way that reaches the people living on that land rather than flowing past them is a question no press release from any of these 3 companies has answered yet. And it is, without question, the single detail worth watching most closely as this moves from exploration into whatever comes next. Jamaica is not the only Caribbean territory currently living through some version of this exact question. Trinidad has spent generations managing the same underlying tension between foreign-operated energy extraction. How much of that wealth actually reaches ordinary Trinidadian households sitting far from the boardrooms making the real decisions? Guyana is living through an accelerated, far higher stakes version of the same negotiation right now through its offshore oil boom, watched closely by economists and by its own diaspora across North America and the United Kingdom. Each of these stories, whether the resource in question is oil or gold or copper, is really asking the same underlying question in a different form. When a small Caribbean nation holds something the rest of the world genuinely wants, Who ultimately decides how that wealth gets divided? And how long does that decision actually take to reach an ordinary family's bank account back home? Jamaica's gold story is still too early to answer that question with any certainty. It is not too early to track it closely enough to recognize the answer the moment it finally arrives, one way or the other. For what it's worth, the parishes at the center of this story, Clarendon and Hanover, and the stretch of central Jamaica now covered by Barrick's 4,000 square kilometers, are not abstractions on a mining company's map. They're places with names, with families who remember exactly what happened the last time a foreign company arrived, promising transformation and left disconnecting the water on its way out. This time, the companies are larger, the data behind them is deeper and more rigorously verified, and the money on the table is measured in the hundreds of millions of dollars rather than the thousands. Whether that difference in scale actually translates into a different outcome for the people living on top of it is the one question this story cannot yet answer, and the one this channel will keep tracking as the drill results come in this October, and every result after it. If this is the kind of story you want more of, deep dive documentaries that connect what's happening underground in Jamaica to what it actually means for diaspora families managing property, employment and investment decisions across an ocean, subscribing genuinely helps us keep building this out at the depth these stories deserve and gets us that much closer to 20,000 of you doing this alongside us. And before you go, tell us in the comments, do you have family with land near any of these exploration zones in Clarendon or Hanover? And has this changed how you're thinking about it? This series continues to track the drill results and resource estimates from Bellas Gate, Superblock and the Paleocene Belt as they come in, alongside the ongoing offshore oil story unfolding on Jamaica's south coast and Guyana's own resource boom, which has already begun reshaping property values for diaspora buyers across an entirely different parish, on an entirely different island chasing a very similar question.